So Jerome Bruner, another very famous contributor to educational psychology, had this quote: Piaget's answers to my questions did not help very much. Too little about the settings in which children live or about the differences produced by those settings. And so Bruner found himself wanting from the Piaget studies because the Piaget studies and how Piaget unpacks the different developmental stages, they tend to have kind of a context free, or another way of putting it is a domain general kind of feel to them. In other words, there's not a lot of specific environmental context. They're more kind of these generic manipulation tasks. And so Bruner, and as we will get to Vygotsky in a moment, was more along the lines of context matters. When you're asked to do something, how you're asked to do it is going to have an association with the particular context at hand. And so I want to unpack this idea a little bit more, but he's kind of getting at it here when he talks about, like, you don't see a whole lot when you're asking a child, which glass has more juice, about how that might be relevant to different classrooms that, or different households that different children live in, right? And how that might produce differences in how they might respond to those particular tasks. So Vygotsky, as I just mentioned, had an idea that was a lot more appealing to Bruner. Now, Bruner had a chance to meet with Piaget in Switzerland. Unfortunately, did not have a chance to meet with Vygotsky. Vygotsky did not live a long life and had long passed away by the time that Bruner and others found Vygotsky's writings. But Vygotsky has become very influential because Vygotsky spoke a lot, more specifically wrote a lot about many of that more context-dependent stuff that Bruner was looking for, that found wanting with Piaget's work. And so Vygotsky's quote here: development does not proceed towards socialization. It's the conversion of social relations into mental functions. And so this is a different story than what Piaget is telling us, because if you look at the Piaget stage theory, it kind of starts with what's developing on the inside and how that inside development manifests and how we're able to perform operations on the outside. So things start more from the inside and kind of work their way outward, if you will. Vygotsky is exactly the opposite. Vygotsky argues that, like, all learning starts on the outside. All learning starts in environmental context. Learning is essentially socialization, right? It's the ability to learn how to function in the world with other people. Language is powerful in this, as you learn to communicate and negotiate to try to move about the world amongst other people. The particular things that you're doing externally in those particular external contexts are things that ultimately get internalized. So in other words, the development starts with how you're developing in your function in the outside world, and eventually that gets habituated and internalized into the inner dialogue that's going on in your head. So this is more of an outside in kind of approach. All learning starts with living in the world, and as we pick up on patterns, we pick up on customs, we develop habits, we learn what does and does not work in social negotiation. Those lessons ultimately get internalized in the form of our knowledge, but it starts with the outside world and moves in, as opposed to like having to have the development first start inside of the head and then manifests in changes in how we're able to manipulate the outside world. So again, what I'm kind of talking about here is a difference between more of a inside out development, which is kind of more Piagetian, versus Vygotsky, which is more of an outside in kind of development. And I'll go back to that idea in a little bit.